Cardiff in the 1930s was a city in transition. For decades, it had been one of the busiest coal exporting ports in the world. The docks at the southern end of the city had handled more coal than almost anywhere else on Earth, and the wealth that came with that trade had shaped the city profoundly. But by the 1930s, the coal trade was in steep decline. Unemployment was rising sharply across South Wales, and Cardiff felt it deeply. Families in the working-class neighbourhoods of the city lived carefully and close together. Terraced streets, corner shops, community schools, and the kind of tight neighbourhoods where everybody knew everybody else. Whitchurch, a quiet residential suburb in the north of Cardiff, was one of those places. Its streets were lined with modest houses. Children played outside. Families knew their neighbours. It was, in almost every respect, an ordinary community going about its ordinary life. Joyce Irene Cox was born in Cardiff in October 1934. She lived with her mother and her 7-year-old brother, Dennis, at 50 Heldon in Whitchurch. Her father, Arthur James Cox, had been a labourer with the Cardiff Gas Company, a working man in a working city. By the autumn of 1939, he had been called up to serve in the army and was away from home. Joyce was the youngest of the family. Those who knew her described her as a plump little girl with fair skin, fair hair, and very rosy cheeks. She attended Whitchurch Infant School. She was 4 years old, just days away from her 5th birthday. By September of 1939, the world that Joyce Cox had grown up in was changing in ways that even the adults around her could barely comprehend. On 3rd September 1939, just 25 days before Joyce disappeared, Britain declared war on Germany. The mood across Cardiff and across Wales changed overnight. Men were being called up. Families were preparing for the worst. Children across the city were fitted with gas masks and drilled in what to do if bombs fell. In the schools of Whitchurch, children arrived each morning carrying their gas masks as a matter of routine. Joyce Cox carried hers too. It had her name and address written on it. On the morning of Thursday, 28th of September, 1939, Joyce went to Whitchurch Infant School as usual. She was wearing a blue velvet frock, a dark blue coat, plaid socks, and ankle-strap shoes. She had her gas mask with her. Morning school ended, and the children were released to go home for lunch. Joyce walked out of the school gates with her brother Dennis and a friend and headed toward home. The children stopped briefly at their grandmother's house on the way. Then they continued toward home. At around 12:45 in the afternoon, somewhere along the streets of Whitchurch, Dennis lost sight of his little sister. When he and the other child arrived at the house of Joyce's aunt, Joyce was not with them. Several school children who had been walking the same route said they had seen Joyce turning into a narrow passage behind the row of houses, known locally as Lucky Lane. A man from the local post office said he also saw her there playing in the lane. Joyce's cousin, Alan Phillips, who lived nearby, later recalled that he had walked with Joyce to the end of that lane and watched her head off in the direction of home. They waved at each other. That was the last time anyone confirmed seeing Joyce Cox alive. When Joyce did not come home for lunch, her mother became alarmed. She went looking for her daughter. Neighbours were asked. Friends were asked. Nobody had seen her come home. The alarm was raised. Police were called. Within hours, a search was underway across Whitchurch. Officers and hundreds of volunteers combing the streets, the lanes, the gardens, the surrounding fields and open land. They searched through the afternoon. They searched through the night. They searched into the following day. Joyce's father was contacted at his army posting and recalled home to be with his family. 36 hours after Joyce had last been seen, on the evening of 29th of September 1939, a man who had been out searching with his spaniel dog was walking along a disused railway embankment near Corriton Station in Whitchurch. His dog began pulling him away from the path, tugging toward a patch of dense undergrowth at the side of the old Taff Mineral railway line. The man let the dog lead him. Among the tangled bushes on the embankment, he found the partially clothed body of a small child. It was Joyce Cox. She was 2 miles from her home on Hale Don. She had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The cause of death was recorded officially as shock. At the scene, police found a tobacco pouch lying nearby. A little further away, they found Joyce's gas mask, the one with her name and address written on it. A copy of the Western Mail newspaper was also recovered at the scene. On 2nd October 1939, some of her missing clothing was found in bushes at a distance from where her body had been left. The location where her body was found could only be reached on foot from 2 separate paths. It was not a place anyone would stumble upon by accident. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive Cardiff had seen. Officers conducted door-to-door inquiries across Whitchurch and the surrounding areas. Witness statements were gathered from schoolchildren, neighbours, and local residents. As the inquiry deepened, a disturbing picture began to emerge. A neighbour of the Cox family drew the attention of investigators. Family members described him as a nasty man, someone who was known to strike the children in the street. Joyce's female cousin later said that this same man had touched her inappropriately. On the day Joyce disappeared, Joyce's aunt told police she had seen this neighbour pushing a wheelbarrow with a sack draped over it in the area. The family's suspicions hardened around him. Whether he was the same person that police had formally identified as a suspect was never publicly confirmed. A boy came forward and told police he had seen Joyce that evening, walking with a man. The inquest into Joyce's death was opened by the coroner for East Glamorgan, Mr. David Rees, and adjourned before resuming in October 1939 at Whitchurch. Arthur James Cox attended in his army uniform. He told the coroner that Joyce had never been accustomed to wandering around alone. When Joyce's mother was called upon to identify her daughter's clothing in court, she collapsed. A man in the public gallery shouted out in her defense before being immediately silenced by police officers. During the inquest, evidence emerged that was deeply disturbing in its implications. The medical and forensic evidence indicated that Joyce had not been taken directly to the embankment where her body was found. She had first been taken to a house. She had been given a meal. She had been kept somewhere for a period of time before being taken to the railway embankment and killed. Someone in the community of Whitchurch, someone who knew those streets and that embankment, had done this. The jury returned a verdict of murder against person or persons unknown. Joyce's funeral was held on 5th of October 1939 at Whitchurch Methodist Church, conducted by Reverend Harry Wilkinson. She was buried at St. Mary's Churchyard. A large crowd lined the streets as the cortege passed. Among the mourners were uniformed and plainclothes police officers, watching the faces in the crowd. No one was ever arrested. No one was ever charged. The case went cold. A file on the investigation was stored at the National Archives. For many years, it was closed to the public. When Joyce's cousin, Terry Phillips, who had spent years trying to get answers for his family, attempted to access the file, he was told it would remain closed. The reason given was that a named suspect was described within it in terms considered derogatory, and that the suspect should not be associated with these matters. Terry Phillips did not accept this explanation. He accused the authorities of a cover-up. The clear implication of the closed file was that someone had been identified, named, described, and then protected from public association with the case. In 2017, 78 years after Joyce's murder, South Wales Police formally reopened the investigation. The case was featured on a BBC Wales true crime series. What the reinvestigation revealed was both significant and deeply frustrating. The prime suspect in the murder of Joyce Cox had died in the 1950s. He had been identified. He had never been arrested. He had never faced justice. He was gone. Joyce's mother lived until 2003. She carried the weight of that September morning in 1939 for the rest of her life. Over 60 years without knowing who had taken her daughter and what had been done to her in the hours before her body was found beside a disused railway line 2 miles from home. She died without answers. Joyce Irene Cox was 4 years old. She had fair hair and rosy cheeks and a gas mask with her name written on it, and a blue velvet frock and plaid socks, and a father away in the army who had just promised her a birthday present she never received. She walked home from school on a Thursday lunchtime in September 1939, waved to her cousin at the end of a lane, and was never seen alive again. Her killer has never been brought to justice. Her case remains open. Hello everyone, thank you for listening, and drop any feedback below. I would love to hear your thoughts and hope to see you again right here on Cold Case UK.